Welcome to Jewish History Soundbites podcast with Yehuda Geberer. Immerse yourself in the rich tapestry of Jewish history as we explore fascinating tales and uncover hidden gems from our glorious past. Brought to you by our proud sponsor, Cross River, a leader at the intersection of financial services and technology, committed to empowering the communities they serve. Cross River's steadfast support fuels our mission to preserve our heritage and foster a vibrant future for all. Contact Cross River through their website at crossriver.com.
A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger.
The 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games.
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Verkaufen Schabbat at the Gitter.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in the Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little, it is never too late, and it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and
Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode we're going to speak about Karaite Jews in the Russian Czarist Empire, Karaim. When we've been discussing in not recent episodes, but before recent episodes, we discussed Russian Jewry under the Tsars, specifically Jews who lived outside the Pale of Settlement. We spoke about privileged Jews who were permitted by special dispensation to reside outside of the Pale. Then we had another episode on Bukharian and Mountain and Georgian Jews who obviously did not live in the Pale of Settlement because their places of origin was in a different part of the Russian Empire. And today we'll discuss the smallest numerically such group, but also the most different and interesting, the Karaites who lived in the Russian Empire. Through an interesting sequence of historical events, they also were permitted to reside outside the Pale, along with the Tsar's government lifting all other sorts of restrictions, which they said did not apply. The government said did not apply to Karaites because the Russian government saw the Karaites as a distinct group from Rabbinic Jews, and it's a very interesting story. Karaites obviously are a Karaim in Hebrew, or Karaim in Hebrew, Karaites in English, and they are a sect which still exists till this very day, a group within the Jewish people, seemingly, that only believes in the written law, the Torah Shebiksav, not in the oral law, the Torah Shebal Peh. And some of them lived in Russia. Now, there's a long history to Karaites, and I'll just refer you to, it's very important to note, the excellent 3-part series on the entire history of the Karaite community in general, not limited to Russia of the 19th century, which is the focus of this podcast. And that is on a different podcast by the well-known and popular historian and friend of mine, Rabbi Aubrey Hirsch, on his very popular podcast, History for the Curious. And I highly recommend that podcast in general, and this series on the history of Karaites in particular. There is no competition among historians. We're all there for each other, so I'm happy to recommend his podcast and listen to it. You'll love it. And specifically, if you're more curious about the history of the Karaites, then listen to his series there on his podcast, History for the Curious. He goes through the entire fascinating history of the Karaite communities in Bavel, in Turkey, in Egypt, in Eretz Yisrael, and everywhere else over more than 1,000 years of history. He also delves into our subject too, Karaites in the Russian Empire, Crimea, Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania. So definitely lots to gain by listening to that. And I used it as well in preparation for this podcast. So I want to specifically focus, because I've been going back again and again to the history of Jews in Tsarist Russia, the 19th century. So I want to focus on that because it's not so well known that there were several prominent Karaite communities in the Russian Empire, and therefore it's a pretty cool story, especially regarding their relationship with the Tsarist government and how they were allowed to live outside of the Pale of Settlement, and they were able to remove all the restrictions, despite the fact that they're Jews, but they were considered different type of Jews by the Tsarist government, and therefore they the legislation was done differently. So Karaites, of course, start in Bavel in either the 8th or 9th century, today's Iraq, and it's prominent in the land of Israel, and it's prominent in Turkey. It's very prominent in Egypt in the Middle Ages. When the Rambam arrives in Fustat in Egypt, where he remains for the rest of his life, he writes how the majority of the community was Karaite. So they're all over the Middle East, and they also, from the 13th, 14th century, they are in the areas that would eventually be called the Russian Empire. Obviously, in the 13th and 14th century, it's not the Russian Empire. It's Crimea's and the Ottoman Empire, and there's the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Polish Kingdom. That's where the Karaites are living from the 13th and 14th century as well. So they're this Jewish community that's racially Jewish and religiously Jewish. They just don't believe in the oral law till today. The community still exists till today, and they still consider themselves Jewish, and so does the state of Israel under the law of return. Karaites are Jews, and therefore they are part of the Jewish community. They just don't believe in the oral law. A very similar, not the same, but a similar to the another Jewish sect from the time of the second Beis HaMikdash called the Tzedukim, Sadducees, whatever it is. But the Karaites are different, and they come much later in history. They're only from the 8th or 9th centuries, and they make it to Eastern Europe during the late Middle Ages, 13th century, 14th century. So there are two areas of Karaite communities in Eastern Europe. In the Crimean Peninsula, which was under the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years, and Poland, Lithuania, the Polish-Lithuanian Kingdom, Commonwealth, whatever you want to call it. In Crimea, it was in several different cities. In Poland, Lithuania, they were in the areas of Galicia, Volyn, especially in the city of Lutzk. So Lutzk is a Karaite center. I don't know if Lutzk today in Lakewood is a Karaite center. I'm not so familiar. I've only davened there once on a visit to America. But back in Poland, it was a Karaite center. I know Reb Zalman Sorotskin was the Rav of Lutzk, but not of the Karaite community. In Poland, there were Karaite communities. Even in Warsaw itself, till today, there's a Karaite cemetery in Warsaw. I've never yet brought a group there, but if any future group wants to go there, I'm happy to bring them there. And especially in Lithuania, of all places, in the town south of Vilna called Trakai, which is actually the ancient capital of Lithuania. In Yiddish, they called it Truk. And Reb Nachum Partsovich, the Mirash Yeshiva, grew up in Trakai, south of Vilna, and his father, Tzvi Aryeh Partsovich, was the rabbi of Trakai. He was murdered by the Nazis, and Trakai had a prominent Karaite community. In fact, they still have a Karaite community. They also have a wooden Karaite, I guess we call it a shul. I think it's called a Knessa or something like that in Karaite language. A wooden one, which makes it a rare historical surviving shul, Karaite shul, and it has a museum there today. In northern Lithuania, in Panevėžys, and several shtetls around the Panevėžys area, all had Karaite communities. So you can imagine Panevėžys had a Karaite community. I don't know if there was a split in the Panevėžys yeshiva of the Karaites or not, but in any case, there was a Karaite community in Ponevezh. So Crimean Karaites were there since the 13th century, and Polish-Lithuanian Karaites were there since the 14th century. Now, obviously, this is all aside from the primary Karaite centers of Turkey, Egypt, Eretz Yisrael, Iraq, and other Middle Eastern areas, which was always considered the center. And the Karaites in Eastern Europe actually corresponded with the Karaite rabbinical leaders, I guess we could call them, or spiritual leaders in the Middle East. The main thing to understand before we arrive in Russia of the 19th century is that the Crimean Karaites were under Ottoman control until the 19th century, and then from the 19th century they were under the Tsars, while the Polish-Lithuanian Karaites were under the control of the Polish Kingdom, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, until the partitions of Poland at the end of the 18th century, where almost all of them fell under the jurisdiction of the Russian Tsars. A small fraction was in Galicia, so obviously they ended up under the Austrian Habsburgs. So when we arrive in Russia of the 19th century, in the Russian Empire, the Tsarist Russian Empire of the 19th century, there's two very distinct Karaite communities that are now unified under Russian rule. The dominant community was always in Crimea. The Polish-Lithuanian one was less central. Czarist Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula from the Ottoman Empire in 1783. So it was right around the same time as the partitions of Poland, which obviously took place in 1772, 1793, and 1795. So the main story which we'll focus on is how the Karaites in Russia formed their own history and their own identity in a very specific way during the 19th century in order to convince the Tsarist government how different they are than Rabbinic Jews, and therefore they should not be categorized with the Rabbinic Jews regarding all the restrictions which were pertinent to Rabbinic Jews. Rabbinic Jews meaning the regular mainstream Jewish population. This must be viewed in context, and the context is as follows. For most of their history in Eastern Europe and outside of Russia, the main Karaite centers in Egypt and Turkey and Eretz Yisrael, the Karaite community continued to promote the idea until today that they are full-fledged members of the Jewish people. They just don't believe in the oral law. They're very religious members of the Jewish people. They're not secular. They just don't believe in the oral law. They have their own interpretation of the written law, and that's how they saw it. But here in Russia of the 19th century, we see a first and only time in Karaite Jewish history. There's this attempt to distance themselves from Rabbinic Judaism in a much more drastic way, which eventually would lead to them completely divorcing themselves from the Jewish people altogether at a much later stage, not in the 19th century, in the 20th century, but even at this earlier stage in the 19th century, they distanced themselves from Rabbinic Judaism in history, in ethnicity, in convincing themselves that they're a different tribe, they're a different ethnic background, they have different origins, different origin story, all in order to convince the Tsarist government that they're different, and they should be considered a different people, and therefore not have any of the Jewish restrictions that the Tsarist government implemented on the regular mainstream Jewish population, such as the restriction of living in the Pale of Settlement and all the other taxes and all kinds of limitations that they had on Jewish society in Russia under the Tsars. So the Karaites wanted to absolve themselves of all of this, so they therefore lobbied this campaign for over several decades of the 19th century to consider themselves a different people. And they were largely successful in this endeavor. And over the course of a few decades in the 19th century, the Tsarist government was ultimately fully convinced that the Karaites were essentially a different grouping than Rabbinic Jews, and therefore the restrictions were lifted slowly but surely, and they became not applicable to the Karaite community. Now, I want to point out that we're talking about a very small number. The number of Karaite Jews in the Russian Empire at its peak seems to be around 13,000 Karaite Jews in the entirety of the Russian Empire. Crimea, Poland, Lithuania, everywhere. So obviously this is a relatively tiny community in both actual and relative size, because there's 5 million Jews in Russia at this time, and only 13,000 of them are Karaites. So really it's not a major story, but since it's a quirk of history, I still find it interesting, even if it's an insignificant relatively story. In 1795, not long after they were absorbed into Tsarist Russia. Karaite leaders succeeded during a mission to St. Petersburg from Crimea in freeing Karaite Jews from the discriminatory double tax to which the rest of the Jews of Russia were required to pay. So their first act of getting themselves separate is already immediately following the annexation to Russia. In 1795, didn't take long. But far beyond the relatively minor accomplishment regarding this specific tax, the mission accomplished something much greater regarding the long-term ramifications of the relationship between the Karaite community and the Tsarist government. Unlike the previous Muslim rulers of the Crimean Peninsula, the Ottoman Empire or the Tatars rulers, whoever it was, the Muslim rulers, did not differentiate between Karaite and Rabbinic Jews regarding taxation and legislation. The Muslim rulers for centuries viewed all of them as Jews, Rabbinic Jews and Karaite Jews. They didn't see any distinction. However, the Tsarist government, this new government that they were under their jurisdiction currently in the late 18th, early 19th century, the Tsarist government was willing to recognize a distinction between the two communities, between Rabbinic Jews and Karaite Jews. From now on, the Karaites would be recognized by the Tsarist government as a distinct community from the Rabbinic Jews. Over the course of the 19th century, the Karaite leaders in Russia would capitalize on this distinction, taking it much further and enabling the Karaites to form a completely different identity, which would be recognized by the Tsar as different than the Rabbinic Jewish identity, and therefore of their destiny in Russia as well. And we'll explain why as we delve into the details. So one of the main emerging leaders of the Karaite community in the Crimean Peninsula at this time was a wealthy and powerful individual named Shlomo or Sima Babovich. He knew how to deal with the Tsarist authorities, and he had a large influence within and outside, externally, with the Karaite community. More importantly, he had a decisive impact on the trajectory of Karaite spiritual leadership in Russia in the 19th century because he provided patronage to several Karaite scholars from Volyn, primarily from the prominent Karaite community of Lutzk, which I mentioned earlier, who moved to Crimea. A whole group of Karaite scholars moved from Lutzk to Crimea. These Lutzk Karaite scholars in Crimea would have a decisive impact on Karaite Jewish history. The first one to arrive was a fellow by the name of Yosef Shlomo Lutzki, from Lutzk, obviously, and he came in 1803, and he started off as a melamed for children and a cipher, a ritual scribe, but he soon emerged as the Avbezdin of the Karaite Kehila in Crimea, in this city in Crimea. And he was one of the most powerful leaders of the Karaite community in that whole region. And soon, he was followed by a stream of Karaite intellectuals from Lutzk, and they migrated to the wealthy and more prominent Karaite communities of Crimea. There's several different cities there in the Crimean area that they settled in. And this included the most famous, or maybe infamous, Lutzk Karaite scholar of all, and his name was Avraham Firkovich. And we'll get to him soon, shortly, along with several others. And this group collectively would have a decisive impact on both the internal life and communal infrastructure of Crimean Karaites, as well as its relationship with the Tsarist government. So the next stage is a delegation of Karaite leaders, mostly wealthy merchants, were dispatched to St. Petersburg in 1827 to have another series of meetings with Tsarist government officials. Because in 1827, we discussed this in another podcast, there was the implementation of the military draft on the Jews of Russia. So the Karaite leaders wanted to petition the government to absolve the Karaites from the draft. So the original draft dodgers were Karaites. I don't know if Karaites in Israel today are draft dodging, and I don't know if today's draft dodgers in Israel would consider themselves Karaites. That's just a joke, though, so don't worry about it. The Karaite delegation was successful in this endeavor, and the Karaites were permanently absolved from the military draft as a result. In this context, it's important to note that it became apparent to the Karaite delegation at this time that the Russian Tsarist government viewed the Karaite community at this point as a completely different community, and they decided that they will invest efforts, scholarly efforts and lobbying efforts, convincing the government how true the assumptions of the government were regarding the Karaites, and to an extreme. And we want to ask ourselves why. Why did the Russian government see the Karaites as different, and how did the Karaites capitalize on this and go ahead over the next few decades, the mid to late 19th century, in convincing the Russian government that their assumption regarding the Karaite community was true? It's because the Russian government, the Tsarist Russian government, I'll say it better, the anti-Semitic Russian Tsarist government, and they had an official policy of being anti-Semitic, they saw Judaism essentially as a product of the Talmud, of the oral law. And therefore, their animosity towards Jews and Judaism, which resulted from a deep religious conviction of the Russian Orthodox Church, so it was a result of how, in the view of Tsarist Russian authorities and the Russian Orthodox Church, they viewed the issue, the problem with Jews, is stemming from the Talmud, because they supposed that the Talmud corrupted Jews and Judaism over the centuries through its laws and values. Since the Karaite community did not believe in the Talmud or Talmudic law, they therefore weren't really Jews from the Tsar's government point of view. So that was the main thing. This was reinforced by two additional, more practical considerations. Number one, the Karaites of the Crimean Peninsula, though not of Poland and Lithuania, they were viewed by the Tsarist authorities as more Asian or Eastern, as opposed to the Jews of the Pale, who they saw as more European or Western. Number two, the Karaites of the Crimea, and again, though not of Poland and Lithuania, but the Tsarist government assumed that the Karaites of Poland and Lithuania had their origins in Crimea, so they assumed to be of similar origin, so they viewed them as one community. So the Karaites were more loyal to the Tsar's government than the local Tatars who lived in Crimea. The local Tatars were not excited to be under Tsarist jurisdiction, and therefore the Karaite Jews were more loyal in the Crimean Peninsula to the Tsarist government. And therefore the wealthy Karaite merchants were also crucial to Russian economic development in the region. So taken all together, especially this idea of the Talmud and Talmudic law that the Karaites did not believe in, and which Russia, the Russian government and church, saw as the main problem of Judaism, therefore they saw the Karaites as a distinct community. Now we'll see that the Karaites capitalized on this. They decided to write their own history, proving that they really are not from Rabbinic Judaism at all. They're from a different origin altogether. We'll get to that shortly. Either way, getting back to the 1827, they're absolved from the military draft. A decade later, in 1837, the Russian government formally codified the legal structure of the Karaite Kehila in Russia with its leadership. And it was very similar to how they classified the Muslim communities of the Crimean region. They had secular and religious administrative leaders with requirements similar to the Rav Mita'am in the Pale of Settlement to register births and deaths and marriages, etc. The economy in Russian Crimea, was generally good in the 19th century, and there were more opportunities for financial success than in other places in Russia. So the Karaites did relatively well financially. In addition, the Lutzk Karaite intellectuals who migrated to Crimea and flourished under their patron Sima Babovich, they developed the spiritual and religious life of Karaites. Remember, Karaites are not like Reform or assimilationist or secular Jewish movements of the 19th century. They're an ancient Jewish community that's very religious and traditional in their own way, according to the written law, not the oral law. So they have a spiritual and religious life as well. They opened a printing press. It was established in the 1830s. They produced educational materials and Karaite Sfarim were printed there and exported all over Karaite communities in Russia and beyond, even to the Karaite community in Egypt. Halachic works, customs, commentaries from the Lutzk Karaites on other Sfarim, and a flourishing of materials in the Karaite tradition. It's fascinating. They even had new Karaite shuls constructed Most synagogues traditionally had what was known in Karaite circles as a medrash, a religious school attached to the shul to serve the youth of the community. And in the relatively large Karaite communities of Crimea, there were several midrashim to serve the community's growing educational needs. Education in Karaite institutions, it's worth emphasizing that Karaites in Russia did not initially speak Russian, and obviously they didn't speak Yiddish either. Unlike their Karaite counterparts in the Middle East, Karaite communities spoke Hebrew or Aramaic or Arabic. Now, the Karaites in Eastern Europe did not speak any of those three, and they didn't speak Russian initially. Soon they were to speak Russian once they integrated. But and they did not obviously speak Yiddish. So what did they speak? What did the Karaites speak? They spoke some sort of Turkic dialect, or rather several Turkic dialects, similar to other Turkic languages spoken throughout the Crimean region. I'm not even familiar with this family of languages so much, but this is what it seems to indicate, that they spoke this Jewish, or Karaite rather, language that was their own kind of language. And the school instruction was in that Karaite language, and their religious schools were at different levels, much like yeshivas in Rabbinic Judaism. The subjects that were taught in Karaite schools were Tanakh and the prayers, and Karaite halacha with their halachic texts and ethics and diktuk. The level of study increased with the influx of the Lutzk Karaite teachers. Most students in Karaite communities finished their studies by age 13, approximately, but some continued further in depth at more advanced ages. As a result of all this, these Lutzk intellectuals, the Karaite communities of Crimea flourishing, and primarily the policies of the Russian Tsarist government. So in the 1830s and 40s, an ambitious historiographical project was initiated by these Karaite Lutzk intellectuals to rewrite the history of the Crimean Karaites in order to give themselves a new identity and to explain to the Russian authorities who they, quote, really were. Until that point in history, all historical Karaite works were really ideological ones. They defined themselves and their history based on their ideological disputes with Rabbinic Judaism. In other words, they defined themselves based on their differences with Rabbinic Judaism. Now, for the very first time in the entire Karaite history, they began to define themselves based on ethnicity, based on an origin story. This took several important directions over the ensuing decades. They first related themselves to ancient Jewish communities of India and China. That was primarily in order to boost their demographic numbers because, like I said, they were a relatively tiny community. They also claimed to be descendants of the 10 lost tribes, exiled during the time of the first Beis HaMikdash, which we'll get to why that was so important, that they were exiled from the time of the first Beis HaMikdash, according to this rewriting of history. We mentioned before that they only arrived in the Crimean Peninsula in the 13th and 14th centuries. So obviously this wasn't true, but this is what they came up with, and this is what they told the Russian government. They also came up with another theory that they have roots in the Khazar kingdom, which also wasn't true, but it sounded good because this way they're actually a Turkic people. They're not racially from the Jews either. They're a different people. They're a different tribal influence. They're a different tribal origin story. So the Khazars, the 10 lost tribes, all these different ancient roots in Crimea. Why? The goal was to convince themselves, and especially the Russian government, of their ancient roots in Crimea, much earlier than when they actually came in the 13th and 14th centuries. And the goal of all that, the importance of that, was that they had to establish that they had nothing to do with Rabbinic Judaism in an ethnic and racial way, not just ideologically, not just as a religious belief, which had been the case until that point. Even more so, not only based on this origin story, not only were they not responsible for the writing of the Talmud or keeping any of its laws because they came way before the Talmud was written, but if their origin story is with the 10 lost tribes or the Khazar kingdom, then they're not to be linked with the events of the Second Temple period in Jerusalem either. What happened towards the end of the Second Beis HaMikdash in Jerusalem, the crucifying of Jesus, right? At the end of the Second Beis HaMikdash under the Roman Empire. So the crucifixion, however you pronounce it, they are not responsible for that. Now, according to the Russian Orthodox Church, the Jews are the ones who killed their God, who killed Yashka. And therefore, that's the main reason for anti-Semitic policy. That's the main reason for being against the Jews. And if the Karaites could convince them that they were not in Eretz Yisrael during the time of the second Beis HaMikdash, they had left way before that, either with the 10 lost tribes or because they come from the Khazars altogether. They have nothing to do with crucifying Jesus, and therefore they are not to be held responsible for that. And therefore they should not be candidates for the discrimination of the Tsarist government towards the Jews, because the Jews are descendants of the ones who did that to Yashka. So the Karaites were not even in Jerusalem at the time when the Jews allegedly did this thing. So Russian Orthodox Church doctrine, and which is responsible to a large extent for the Tsarist official anti-Semitic policy in the empire, therefore would see the Karaites as a separate entity. In this fashion, the Karaites successfully absolved themselves conveniently from any Jewish connection in the Christian context of responsibility for the killing of Jesus. And therefore, they should not be victims of any anti-Jewish legislation as a result. It was a brilliant idea, which the Karaite historians of the mid-19th century came up with, and it was ultimately incredibly successful because the Tsarist government bought the story lock, stock, and barrel. And it is in this framework that the research, writings, collections, gravestone studies, and forgeries of the most important Karaite player came into the fore, and that is Avraham Firkovich, who I mentioned earlier. He was an incredible researcher and collector. He went collecting documents and documenting ancient Karaite history all over, not just the Crimean area, but he traveled to the land of Israel, to Egypt, to Turkey, spent years on the road all over and other parts of Europe, and he methodical, and he had these massive collections, all of which are in Russian archives now, huge. You're talking about tens of thousands of documents. He documented ancient cemeteries with Karaite writing and Karaite burials. He was very into gravestones. Some of it was actually authentic research and documentation, the rest of which was outright forgery. In other words, when he didn't have documentation to back himself up, he just made it up. How much of it is authentic and how much of it is forgery is actually still being determined until today. We don't know until today from the Firkovich collections how much of it he did as real research and how much of his documents are real and how much is straight up forgeries. So he has lots of it which are forgeries that he deliberately forged. So he some of his gravestone discoveries predated Karaite settlement in the area, and some of his gravestone discoveries, quotation discoveries, they predated any settlement in the area. So he had Karaite gravestones from before there was any people living in that region. That's fine. Either way, so he published a lot and maintained active correspondence with scholars all over the world and assembled this massive archive and collections. Amazing work, and like I said, pretty talented as a forger as well. The result of all this came in stages. The legislative result in 1852, the Tsarist government said no more restriction of the Pale of Settlement, the greatest accomplishment that the Karaites could have dreamed of. They are not required to live in the Pale. In 1863, a decade later, Karaites are considered equal citizens in the Russian Empire. Essentially, they achieved emancipation. So the legislative result was spectacular. It was also during this time that the Lithuanian Karaites gained in prominence as a second center in Russia after Crimea, especially in Trakai and in Ponivish. This was also due to the effects of the Crimean War, which had an adverse impact on the Crimean Karaites and led to significant internal migration. With permission granted to reside anywhere in the empire, even outside the Pale of Settlement, so Karaite communities sprung up in Odessa, Kiev, Kharkov, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other places. The inner communal result was integration. Now they achieved emancipation. They were allowed to live outside the Pale. So surprise, surprise, there's a trend towards secularization, integration, Russification of the Karaite communities. And this is the most fascinating and obvious result of this integration: Russification and secularization. There's this critique from the youth on the old-fashioned ways of the traditional Karaites of the older generation, because secularization was endemic to the 19th century and in every society, and not only in Jewish, or in this case, Rabbinic Jewish society. This was a Haskalah type of criticism. There was economic integration, general education. They started pursuing general education, educational reform in the Karaite schools. There's a shift from the traditional Turkic language to speaking primarily Russian. There's a flourishing of secular Karaite literature and poetry. Scholarly works such as history and even newspapers from the Karaite community were published almost exclusively all in Russian. And the traditionalists in Crimea capitulated to the reformers, to the secularized Karaites, partially. In 1895, they opened a rabbinical school, which was a modern Haskalah-oriented school, which is incorporated language and general subjects along with traditional Torah Karaite subjects, a 7-year program, incredibly enough. But many of the schools in the area remained completely traditional, even in the early 20th century. So Karaite tradition persevered despite secular inroads, which I find to be such a fascinating story because, this is just a microcosm of what's going on in the rest of the world. We talk about secularization in the 19th century in all kinds of countries that Jews receive emancipation and equal rights, countries where they're allowed to integrate more, or just all kinds of external pressures and modernization, industrial revolution and technology and political change, economic change that caused secularization. And therefore it's not unique to the Jewish story. And here you have this tiny little community of Karaites, and they actively promote their integration, right? No more Pale of Settlement, and they lobby for emancipation. They receive emancipation. And what's the result of all that? Secularization. Surprise, surprise. So it happens everywhere at any time. And that's important to remember, that Jews don't live in a vacuum, and these things happen in every society. Related to this kind of is this interesting side story that a lot of maskilim of Eastern Europe corresponded with the Karaites and actually looked up to them in their scholarship because they also had their critique on the Talmud and Talmudic law, and they felt that the Karaites, who only observed the written law, may be able to serve as kind of like a role model for the new era, the new modern era. That's an interesting story that we can perhaps explore another time. Now it continues. If we jump ahead of the story, the real de-Judaization of distancing from Judaism altogether, of Karaite tradition in Russia. It's important to note that the Karaites of Turkey and Egypt and Eretz Yisrael and Iraq stayed much more traditional and much closer to the original Karaite traditions and much more religious according to the Karaite traditions, even into the 20th century. So we're speaking specifically about the Russian Karaites at this point. So the real de-Judaizing came under the famous Karaite leader, or infamous Karaite leader, Sharia Shapshal. He completely removed them from the Jewish people. He banned Hebrew. He claimed they're not Jewish altogether. They're different Turkic origin. They have no connection at all to Judaism. And that really takes place more in the Soviet Union. Karaites in the Soviet Union, complete secularization. It was very, the religious persecution was relevant to the Karaites as well. And if we jump ahead of this story, just because this is an interesting ending, is that in a real ironic quirk of history is that the Karaite removing themselves from the Jewish people ultimately saved them in the Holocaust. The Nazis went by this logic as well, that the Karaites were not racially Jewish, and therefore the Karaites were not included in the final solution. This had an incredible, even smaller side story, where some Jews were able to either be hidden by Karaites, Karaites saving Jews, or forging documents proving that they were Karaites, giving them a Karaite identity, and therefore that saved their lives. In fact, I had read about this, and I was fascinated by the idea And then I conducted an interview with a Holocaust survivor in Ramat HaSharon here in Israel. He was a Holocaust survivor from Warsaw. At the beginning of the war, he and his family, he was a child, he and his family escaped to Vilna. In Vilna, after the Nazi invasion with Operation Barbarossa, June 22nd, 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union, so they wanted to save themselves from the final solution. They were from a wealthy family in Warsaw originally, so wealthy secular family. He grew up completely secular, very wealthy. And his parents bought forged identity papers giving them a Karaite identity. And he and his family, the entire family, lived openly as Karaites, as fake Karaites. They were forged documents throughout the Holocaust under Nazi occupation. And this helped them survive the war. And he told me the story himself. It was incredible. So it wasn't just that I read it in books. I heard it from someone who was actually saved that way. So that's a fascinating postscript. So this is Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can help the podcast by telling your friends and family about the podcast. Jewish History Soundbites, you can find it on any podcast platform. You can also leave a rating and review. That also helps the algorithm on the podcast. And you can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach out to me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. And I hope you enjoyed.